Hi everyone, it's me, Dan, your instructor. Today, I am coming to you with a video about creative networks. This will include information about Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube, with a vignette made by Reddit and a supporting role for Snapchat. So, let's get started. These are networks that are organized around creative output. And often these are called user-generated content networks. This is particularly common in the literature generated in Europe. Um, and the idea here is that these are networks that are not about underlying organizations like your family or friend structure, like an affinity network, as we studied during week 3, a moment in time, like Twitter, that we studied in week 4, or your location, as we saw in the case of locative media during week 5. There are these other kinds of networks, and what's really interesting is that these networks may be some of the oldest networks we've encountered. So if you think about the history of social media, and think about things like the Usenet, the BBS, right? These were, to some degree, locative, but also they were topical, right? These weren't people who were saying, well, let me get my family together and talk about XYZ. It was people who were interested in something. Now, of these networks, I believe that Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube are the most important. And this is not a monolithic category, right? It is entirely possible that there are new kinds of networks that are appearing out there that I don't even know about. And if you find one of those, please let me know. I will get on it and use it like wild. Um, so I made a little graph over here for you. It's a 2x2, which talks about the idea of a continuous and a sort of discrete network, and also the idea of a strong profile and a weak profile. So what I mean by continuous and discrete is in the organization of the flow on the network. So when we talk about a continuous flow on a network, we're saying, does it go smoothly from one thing to the next in a sort of homogeneous way? So when you watch YouTube, there often are YouTube playlists and things that are curated in such a way that you're part of a single stream of media. Now, YouTube has a weak profile. Except for certain ultra power users of YouTube, people aren't networking with those people and thus following them or working as an affinity network. They're watching things that are topically organized. On the other hand, a strong profile is developed in Instagram, and it's quite continuous, as you all know from using the feed. Facebook, on the other hand, uses a discrete model, as especially in their primary product, they really want to break things up. And then finally, we have Pinterest, which has a weak profile system. At times, they've really modulated the profiles down. And at the end of the day, it's about the individual units. So, Pittman and Reich have made an important finding, as you've read in your research for this week, which suggests that your use of image-based networks makes you feel less alone. Now, they have a variety of ways they plumb into the analysis of variance of their finding. And I think a really important takeaway, and I think you'll really enjoy reading this article, is that image-based networks, it may not be the image itself, but it could be some of the topics. So you start thinking about what it means to share text-based information, and how do we even parse what a text and an image network is, right? So is Facebook a text network? Is it an image network? Is it a network that focuses on creative content or other kinds of images? What we know is that people who use image-driven networks, especially Instagram, feel less lonely. And that's really important. Although in this version of the class we won't talk about public health extensively, there is a very real dimension of SNS use, as you noticed during the reading for week 3, that ephemeral media doesn't provide the same level of social support that affinity-based media does. But what we're finding is that these image flows in Instagram do provide some level of emotional and social support. Now, of course, Pittman and Reich say there are diminishing returns here. They're not saying just increase Instagram use to decrease loneliness and increase satisfaction with your life. There's clearly going to be a point where being on Instagram more will be a problem. Beyond that, I think it is reasonable to think about the cause-effect-effect-cause relationship here. Is it being on Instagram that made you feel less lonely, or is it that you tended to be less lonely, so you went on Instagram? I don't know if we'll ever truly be able to parse out those relationships. This is why we have social science. Let's talk about YouTube. YouTube is really interesting. There's not as much research as I would like about YouTube, and a lot of the research is older. The bigger topic of that research was a long-standing debate in computer science about real names, and that really has fallen away. So there was a burst of YouTube research around 2009, and a lot of that research now is on the economics of YouTube, which I think is really interesting. There's a changing role of money on YouTube. For a while there was a sort of road to stardom, making haul videos, but that road is in decay. There's a really important movement afoot among large corporations. It's called brand safety. And what brand safety means is that large companies really want to be careful about who they're giving money to. They don't want to have their IP right next to something that's really yucky, right? So they're really going through and taking a look at some of the places where their videos were being advertised. So an example from my life, I have several small children. We would watch videos of Sesame Street clips, old Sesame Street clips. And you would think there would be child or family-friendly advertising with these. Nope, horror movies. And so when you're watching Big Bird with your kid, do you really want a slasher to pop up on the screen? That makes no sense. So if you're the marketer of that slasher film, did you actually market to the person you wanted? If, say, you're a maker of a hippie food product, do you really want your advertisements appearing on alt-right journals? No, right? So part of this is about rationalizing the business process. And so during the first phase of the digital transition, there was a lot of optimism. In the second phase, we had a lot of folks who were not minding the shop as much as they would have with traditional legacy media. And now we're seeing a lot of the same kinds of auditing and careful accounting coming to online. And that's really going to be very difficult for a lot of heavy-duty YouTube users because, honestly, their content just isn't good enough for a lot of corporations to want to advertise with it. Now, there are certain genres that really work on YouTube, like haul videos, unboxing videos, tutorials are really, really strong. People love them. They're very generous. It's a really powerful genre. And then finally, there's a genre I generally call FM radio. So these are people who are doing similar kinds of stuff to what you would normally see associated with an FM radio station in a large city. So to use an example, I was listening to FM radio while driving around a large eastern United States city in recent weeks, and a part of their game for one of their morning shows was sending a person out onto freeway overpasses wearing a full face mask with a sign saying something bizarre. And so the sort of contest was how long would it take for the police to come talk to the person, and if so, what would happen to them? And the police were very kind, and they're just like, we understand, keep doing what you're doing. So say FM radio, what do I mean here? Think about your characters on these platforms, the ones who've been successful. Are they offering the sort of deep, insightful content that you're looking for? If you're thinking about Adam Neely, the answer would be yes. He's a wonderful music theory YouTuber. At the same time, you think about a Logan Paul trying to find a dead body, you start to get at the FM radio idea. So this isn't a new style of content. We've seen it before. It's just migrated. There also is some limited networking capacity. YouTube is not really necessarily designed for you to have the sort of flow experience of comments or likes that you would get through Facebook. Now, some of those functions are there. You do have likes and you can do subscribed. But this begs a question. Is this social media at all? Or is this something else? Now, I would say the ability to build the profile, network, browse, affiliate, all are reasons why it is social media. At the same time, we are starting to get toward the boundary, and maybe we do need a new term like UCG to be able to handle systems like YouTube. And then finally, the idea of the pivot to video, right? This is often an afterthought among students, but this is a pretty big deal from about 3 years ago. That advice came that there was going to be a new wave of video production and that everyone wanted video in their social feeds. Now, of course, there is strong content on YouTube, but the analytics that were used to justify the pivot were not particularly accurate. The numerator in some of their equations was wrong. And so there are a lot of layoffs happening in the industry now because the pivot to video was not nearly as effective as people thought it would be. And so I think these are the really important things to think about with YouTube. And from a business and a marketing standpoint, you really have to think about the future of brand safety and your platform. One of the things I hear regularly is, why are there so many people putting out such high quality video on YouTube? Why can't the big TV channels keep up with that content level? And I say, do you really think that just using a 4K camera and recording nonsense is content? That's a real question, right? Is that content? Is it meaningful? Unscripted stuff just like, hey, here's me with a 4K camera. It reminds me very much of the first couple of months when GoPros were a thing, and basically anyone with a skateboard and a GoPro was making successful skateboarding videos. I remember working with students in that time period, and that industry never really took off because, just random footage is only really shocking until that camera's ubiquitous. Here's an important idea, and you do have an article about this that compares Instagram and Pinterest. You can go back and look in the week 4 research on Snapchat, especially the idea of ambient social support as a concept. And this is a really important piece of the story of social media. And I describe this in my book as well. People use social media because it does things for them emotionally. It makes them feel better. It makes them feel supported. It makes them feel less alone. There is a fantastic literature base on these questions, which is stuff you should think about. It's also part of the tragedy of social media that we had such an opportunity to create a beautiful source of emotional support for people, and we just kind of messed it up. So we get this idea that you see in some of the research for this week that Instagram and Pinterest both can decrease loneliness. But what's really interesting is after using Instagram, people tend to have an increased level of self-monitoring while they have a decreased level with Pinterest. And so you could then use Pinterest, be interested in Pinterest, have a nice time using Pinterest, and actually feel better about yourself. Isn't that interesting? Now, of course, you have people in your feed and in your lives who are probably saying that using Pinterest is a sort of consumerist nightmare, and that getting off of these platforms will make you more real and more authentic. Well, here's what I'd tell you to think about here. People get social support from these platforms. It makes them feel less alone. It makes them feel like they have a lower level of self-monitoring. They feel better about themselves. Are these platforms really bad? And what kind of people and to what end are they arguing against these platforms? To some degree, there is a real dimension of privilege embedded in that position, where you have so much social support that you can tell other people, and this is Rains and Size research not assigned for this week, that the level of social support then that people get from these networks is actually inverse of the normal role in society. So it's the people who need the most support who get the most support. So then we have people with high levels of support then who are denigrating a way that people can actually support themselves and feel better and make meaningful interventions in their own lives. Interesting, right? Let me give you the executive summary there. The executive summary being that these platforms, especially Pinterest, this has a flow interface with highly focused users who use the platform for extended time periods. It is a clear and powerful business model, combining advertisements and affiliate links, along with particular analytics products. This is a wonderful product and company that actually has the ability to make real money. It's still private. What that means is you can't buy Pinterest stock on the stock market. They could potentially have an IPO in the coming year or two at a very reasonable valuation. What? That last slide should shock you. So Pinterest has a great interface that people have copied and that is highly effective and it's actually shaping web aesthetics today. They have a business model and they are so successful they haven't had to raise money on the stock market. Hello? Why is this? Why isn't the industry just going wild for Pinterest? And it's because of sexism. So let's talk about gender and Pinterest. So historical note, the big topic about Pinterest for many years was gender. And so the big topics of what were ostensibly the sort of smart think pages were, can Pinterest survive without men? And when the man-tristing sites, yes, there were really articles about the coming wave of man-tristing sites, when they would overtake the ostensibly inferior Pinterest. Let's think about that for a second. Man-tristing sites? Why would these automatically overtake a strong incumbent like Pinterest? Why was Pinterest assumed to be inferior? This is like someone saying that any upstart would overtake Facebook in like 2008. It would be a ridiculous assertion. But in the context of Pinterest, this is a serious thing we need to think about. It's because people don't like platforms that are primarily visited by women. Now, there were many defenses of Pinterest, including a wonderful article in the New Yorker defending the idea of a space that was not necessarily intended for men. And this gets to a really important double standard, which is the idea of pure demographics. This has been a central idea in the industry for years. that a platform like a Facebook or a Pinterest or a Twitter or something else could get pure demographics, and that a pure demographic of people focused on some particular end is basically the gold standard for an online audience. Guess who has it? Pinterest. The second Pinterest gets it, the advertising industry's discourse switches and becomes committed to something else, like apparently heterogeneous, impure demographics. And so everyone who follows the advertising industry, like your professor, is just taken aback by the inability of the industry to maintain a clear standard for what it wants. It's almost as if they couldn't handle the idea that they were delivered the thing that they've been asking for so many years. And so this is something to really think about, and it happens in TV and a number of other creative industries as well. There really isn't a great way for us to be able to parse some things like demographics or industry discourse because they are so inconsistent. Let's talk about Insta. It's a changing platform. It's a visual interface with an affinity landing page and a very rich, topically organized discover system. And I think that's really important to think about. There is both the feed on Instagram, which is Facebook-like and discrete. There is also the feed on Instagram that is very much like Pinterest, the continuous flow. Now, there is some research that would suggest that Instagram is extremely scopophilic. That means taking pleasure from viewing. Now, this is a disputed point, by the way. We'll get to that by the end of this slide. So one of the ways that I try to look for this is by going into the topical hashtag areas on Instagram and seeing what's popular. And I would suggest you do that. Go look at it. See what are the visual traits, what are the styles that make something popular, and take a look, I would say every day, maybe a couple of times a day, at the Instagram TV section and see what's popular. I've been noticing to this point that it is primarily repurposed older content that fits into the FM radio genre, unfortunately. Now, some people like Anderson .Paak have extended the feed level of art. So you look at his feed and it's actually designed in such a way that as you flow through it, it is a piece of art. And this is something to consider that is to some degree beyond the range of this class. We will talk about this in other quarters. Instagram TV has similar dimensions that we've seen. If you're interested in Instagram TV, you should know that it is the same interface as Facebook used for a product called Facebook Paper. And so I'm not sure what its future is, and given my current monitoring of it, I don't think it's that promising. Now, Sheldon and Bryant's research on high Instagram use says it's connected with high social interaction, and they say that Instagram has brought 2 new categories into the base research on uses and gratifications, specifically documentation and creativity. So the uses and gratifications tradition goes back to the 1930s. It is a deep and rich theory base in communication research. So what we're trying to see is why people use media and why they think it's good, right? That's uses and grats, as we call it, or UG. And so when we start to see this, they were finding that people were using this sort of documentary function, that they were using it to make certain evidences of a trace. And I think there's an incredible and fascinating well of cultural theory developing on this right now. The idea of the indexical trace, and that people now increasingly need to create evidence that things happened in a world and have that be temporally bounded. It needs to be instant and it needs to be fresh in a world where seemingly so much experience that was taken for granted now has to be verified. And creativity gets right to the core of this week's topic, which is what does it mean for you all to use these systems and organize yourselves around certain kinds of content? And so they found those dimensions were new uses and gratifications, and that we are starting to revise the theory base to deal with the reality that Instagram and some of these platforms have brought us some new categories we have to deal with. Now, aesthetic is important. So this is the big mood of this week's lecture. Now, you read Manovich on this, and he thinks that there is a new sort of meta-circulation that is ontologically distinct. Let me break down those words for y'all. Meta-circulation means people are sending things around the network not as a primary piece of communication, but as communication about communication. So when you all share a meme with the tag big mood, you're basically 10 levels of meta in, right? And for those of you who don't know Big Mood, it's time to start looking around at that. Now, ontological means a new kind of thing. So the rules he has found for the designed aesthetic of Instagram would suggest that it's highly produced, there are a few topics and styles, and that within a single producer's work, there is no breaking. They don't put in candids, they don't break their style. His big case study on this is Kinfolk magazine from Portland. Now, one interesting thing to know is that some of the aesthetic that has been isolated in this research was not produced on the fly. They actually tried a couple aesthetics and then went back and deleted things. And I think this is something very important to know about social media research today, is people do A/B test. And they'll do it for a couple weeks, and then if they see one thing is working and the other isn't, they'll go back and just destroy the other thing. So it looks like they always had the intention for the new thing. So what circulation gets us is a creative process where layers of informal knowledge are made concrete. And I think you really saw this in our work last week on maps, where we started to think about the informal knowledge that people have within a location and how that accretes into something else. But in the case of Instagram, it's about a topic and a style. So I want to end this week with a provocation. What about Reddit? There's a number of different great ways to research Reddit. It's a really interesting platform with some really highly cohesive communities. At the same time, Reddit is an example of successful network pruning. A few years back, they decided to eliminate some of the most toxic subreddits and users, and it's generally been regarded as a huge success. I've had some students say, no, it hasn't been, and then we look at things like advertising sales, users, whatever else, and it has been successful by those metrics. And so what do we do with Reddit? Right? Reddit profiles. Are they real? Are we comfortable with the idea that any number of Reddit profiles, like mine, are automatically populated with my work on the network? So let's say we have an internal profile versus an external profile. That my profile on Reddit is entirely populated by what I have done with it. It is not populated by who I am in the broader world. And Reddit, as you may have noticed, is the source of content for so many organizations like your BuzzFeeds and whatever else. So clearly, there is something happening here. The topical organization, the people, the play, the way they create their big moods is doing something that is productive and is reflexive. So clearly, Instagram, Pinterest, Reddit, they're the future, YouTube too. But will any of these be the real winner? Or are each of their communities and interfaces so distinct that we will continue to see there be 4 or 5 different products? Can anyone truly pivot to video? Could Instagram actually become YouTube? If you were to ask me today, my conclusion is that Instagram TV actually breaks the flow, the purity of flow and structure that you see in Instagram's primary interface, and in fact is not compatible with Instagram at all. In which case, it could easily just be shut off next week, which would also explain why Facebook reused an interface they had already workshopped on it rather than developing a new one for Instagram. At the same time, we have seen that locative media, especially, as we discussed last week, were successfully flanked, especially by Facebook. And so it seems possible that a pivot to video or a pivot like that could eliminate some of these networks. Beyond that, it's possible that poor management could destroy something like a Reddit, that they could once again allow things to get too toxic, or they could manage it too much, as Friendster did. In short, these creative networks where people organize topically give us a chance to really look at uses and gratifications of social media use and the role of creativity and structure and interaction in ways that we just can't get with time-based, locative, or affinity networks. And these then really become, I think, the backbone for network styles for understanding all of social media. Of course, not everything is discrete, not everything fits neatly into a single category, but the category that comes first with a network is how we should evaluate it. So we have different tools and thought processes for evaluating Facebook versus Twitter versus Foursquare Swarm versus Instagram. There is a sort of a hiding network type here that we're still trying to figure out what to deal with. It's called ephemeral networks. Those specifically are Yik Yak, which was locative ephemeral, and then Snapchat, which is affinity ephemeral. There are other ideas like Whisper and a few others that are temporal for ephemeral. One topic we will be working out in the winter version of this class on campus is ephemeral actually a network type, or is it an affordance of an interface? And that's something I want you to think about too, because this is an important idea for the future. Are we really interested in ephemeral as ephemeral, or are we interested in what ephemeral social support means? And so far, it appears that ephemeral is fun, but it doesn't have the social support characteristics we have seen from other network types. Enjoy this week. I'm going to release most of the content for the rest of the course after this week. So we'll do all of the foreign policy and domestic policy and some public health material during weeks 7 and 8. And you'll have some flexibility about when to complete your second paper and, of course, your final exam. Now, everything will need to be done, though, by the end of the course. Have a great week.